Good GUS The Cattle are Restless by May Charles, illustrated by Michael LaDuca. This is the story of Gus, the Sheriff of Pecos, a small town in Texas, which is also the home of the Lone Ranger and Davy Crockett. He's known as Good Gus because he always does the right thing. He's a good sheriff because he looks after Pecos and all its people. It was a gorgeous sunny day in Pecos, Texas. Gus had just finished his rounds on Main Street and was heading south today to check on the families who lived outside of town. That was his job, to make sure the town and its people were safe, including those folks who lived a little ways out of the town itself. He had just finished a big breakfast at Mary's cafe. Mary and her husband, Fred, with their two boys, JC and Jimmy Ray, had moved to Pecos in the spring. They liked Pecos so much that they decided to stay and open a small cafe. Mary served a delicious breakfast and a very tasty dinner as well. She was closed at lunchtime so she could look after her two children and tend to her small garden. Mary was a very pleasant person who always had a smile on her face. Her husband, Fred, worked with Ray, the blacksmith, and between the two of them, they kept all the horses showed in and around Pecos. Ray, as the blacksmith, made all the horseshoes out of hot iron, and Fred, as the farrier, put the shoes on horses' hoofs using square nails. They both loved working with the hot furnace and had begun trying out new ways to bend metal and make items. Some of the townspeople would come in with their ideas of wanting something, such as a tool for gardening or for tending crops. Fred and Ray would go right to work them. Most of the time they came up with good ideas and made interesting items that really did the job. On this beautiful September day, a stranger rode into town. He was wearing a bright red shirt, black jeans, chaps, black boots, and a big black Stetson hat. He was riding a shiny black horse. He didn't look like Bad Bart, but people were nervous the moment they saw the black horse. The stranger seemed to know exactly where to go. He pulled right up in front of the sheriff's office and tied his horse to the hitching post. Fred was walking to the cafe to eat lunch with Mary and the boys when Fred saw him and said, "Howdy." The stranger said howdy, and started to walk towards Sheriff Gus's office. Fred said, "If you are looking for Gus, he's out checking the families south of the town and won't be back for a few hours." By this time, the stranger began walking back towards Fred. Fred wasn't afraid because the cowboy had a pleasant look on his face. The stranger then said, "Hi, my name is Corey. Do you know where I can get a bite to eat?" Fred said, "Normally, at Mary's cafe, but she doesn't serve lunch." "Where are you from?" Corey replied, "I'm from Fort Worth. I'm Gus's cousin. I've come to Pecos to help Joe Kelly drive his cattle to Fort Worth next month." Fred replied, "Well, I am happy to meet you and I have great news. Now, Corey, if y'all come home with me and we'll ax your hungry stomach right up." Corey smiled a really big smile and said, "Why, thank you. But you never told me your name." Fred smiled back and said, "I'm Fred Band, and Mary is my wife. I work with her in the early morning at the cafe, and then I work down at the blacksmith's with Ray in the afternoon." Fred led Corey around to the back of the cafe, and then into his house, where Fred immediately introduced Corey as Gus's cousin. Corey received a hearty welcome, and was almost a little glad Gus wasn't around. He was really enjoying himself. Mary put an extra plate on the table, and Corey ate with the Bands. He thought to himself, "This is mighty ain food, better than I eat in Fort Worth." After lunch, around 2:30, Fred went back to work at the blacksmith's shop, and Corey walked down Main Street with him. Just as they reached the blacksmith's, Gus rode into town. Gus knew instantly that it was his cousin. He was the only cowboy he had ever met that wore a red shirt. Gus was really happy to see Corey. It had been over 2 years since they last saw each other. Fred introduced Ray to Corey, and then Gus and Corey walked to the sheriff's office. When Gus tied up Coco, his dark brown horse with the white streak on his face, he saw Corey's horse, Midnight, who turned his head and whinnied a hello to Gus. Gus and Corey went into the sheriff's office and talked for a long time. Finally, they went around to the back of the jail and into Gus's home. Once they settled down, Gus made BBQ for supper, and they both went to sleep early. because they had a big day coming up. The next morning, after Gus's rounds, Corey and Gus headed to Joe Kelly's ranch. Naturally, when they arrived, Joe was happy to see them both. He didn't know that they were cousins. Gus had a good visit with Joe and his family, and then headed back to town. He had made Corey promise to come into town and say goodbye before the cattle drive next month. 3 weeks slipped by before Corey returned to town. Everyone now knew that Corey was Gus's cousin, so as he moseyed down Main Street, all the townspeople said hello to him. Corey thought to himself, what a nice town, and what really friendly people. Corey went directly to Gus's office and had another long visit. Corey said goodbye and told Gus he'd try to come back soon. Corey and Joe rounded up all the cattle and drove them into the corral overnight. Tuesday morning, before the sun was up, Joe and Corey began heading out. Old Tex was in the rear with the supply wagon. Now, Joe's ranch was about 10 miles outside of Pecos, so that by the time they were approaching the edge of town, the sun was up, and people were going about their daily lives. The following Monday, Joe and Corey began getting the cattle ready for the drive. They packed a wagon with plenty of food, blankets, pots and pans, cups and silverware. Joe had hired Old Tex to come along as the cook. Old Tex had been on many cattle drives, but didn't want to do the hard work of driving the cattle, although he liked the trip. All of a sudden, one of the cattle was startled by a prairie dog. He started drifting off, so Corey yelled to Joe that he'd go get him. Pretty soon, several cows were heading off the trail and moving at a very fast pace. This made Corey very nervous because, as the cattle began heading towards town, they might stampede. Corey called to Joe and said, "Get Old Tex and the wagon up here. I'm going to rush into town because I think the cattle may stampede." Joe nodded yes, and Corey took off on Midnight. He urged Midnight to go as fast as he could. As soon as Corey was close to town, he began yelling, "Everyone, get off the streets and into your homes as fast as you can. Joe's cattle are going to stampede. Hurry." Gus, where are you?" Gus came eyeing out of his office and yelled, "Corey, what's going on?" Corey yelled back, "I think the cattle are going to stampede. Get as many wagons as possible and bring them to the end of Main Street. Also, line up as many bales of hay as possible. This may stop them, or at least slow them down. I'm heading back to help Joe." Corey turned around and galloped away. Gus went to the stable, which was next to the blacksmith's, and told Fred and Ray to get as many wagons as possible and block Main Street. Everyone in the town was frightened. They had never seen a stampede, and the townspeople had no idea what to expect. As soon as Fred and Ray moved a few wagons to the end of Main Street, they dragged bales of hay and placed them in front of the wagons. Within minutes, they could hear the thunderous roar of the cattle as they were coming their way. Fred and Ray quickly moved off the street into the blacksmith's shop. Gus rode up and down Main Street, telling everyone not to be afraid, that Corey knew what he was doing, and that everything would turn out to be all right. Meanwhile, Corey was rushing towards the stampede. He began yelling and shouting at the cattle to turn around. Midnight Horse was whinnying at the cattle, as if he could somehow talk to that stampeding herd. Corey managed to split off several of the cattle and separate them from the herd. He then took his canteen and began spilling water on the few cows that were at the head of the herd. This startled them into stopping almost right before the wagons and edge of Main Street. Finally, the cattle began to quiet down and graze along the edge of the trail. After all the dust had settled, Joe rode over to Corey. "I thought this was going to be really bad, but you saved the day and probably most of the town." Corey just smiled, turned Midnight around, and then rode back to round up the few stragglers and move them back towards the main herd. Just then, Fred and Ray came out of the blacksmith's shop, and they couldn't believe their eyes. They began moving the wagons back, and then stopped to watch Gus ride out to meet Corey at the edge of town. Slowly, the townspeople came out from their homes and shops. They were all so relieved that they started to rush out towards the herd. Corey immediately told Gus to ride back and make the people stop. Then, as the townspeople stopped, they started calling out to Corey their thank you for saving them in their town. Gus stopped his horse and said, "Be quiet. We don't want another stampede." Everyone moved down Main Street, and Fred called to Gus, "Get Corey down here." Gus waved to Corey to come back into town. Corey rode in and headed towards the far end of Main Street, where all the townsfolk had gathered at Mary's cafe. They all began cheering Corey and told him he was a very brave cowboy. Then one person in the crowd said, "Let's call him Courageous Corey because he showed great courage and saved our town." From then on, Courageous Corey was the town hero.